The morning mist clung to the jungle canopy of Bougainville like a shroud, but beneath it lay something far more sinister than nature intended. The Japanese had spent months carving their masterpiece of death into the volcanic soil, a fortress so cunningly designed that American commanders would later call it simply the Hornet's Nest. But on this January morning in 1944, steel beasts approached through the undergrowth and, carrying within their bellies a weapon that would redefine the very nature of warfare in the Pacific. What emerged from those tanks wasn't bullets or shells, it was liquid fire, and it would turn the Japanese defenders' greatest strength into their final tomb. Welcome to World War IIpedia, where we uncover the untold stories that shaped the Second World War. Today we're diving into one of the most innovative and terrifying weapons ever deployed in the Pacific theater, a story of American ingenuity born from desperation, and the ordinary men who turned an impossible idea into a war-winning reality. December 7th, 1941, didn't just drag America into World War II, it exposed a harsh reality that military planners had been reluctant to face. While the United States had been perfecting mass production and industrial might, our enemies had been perfecting the art of killing at close quarters. The Germans had their flamethrowers, the Japanese their own portable flame units, and suddenly American GIs were facing an enemy armed with weapons that seemed to come straight from the depths of hell itself. The reports filtering back from the early Pacific campaigns painted a grim picture. Japanese defenders, fanatically committed to their emperor, had turned every island into a fortress. They didn't just dig foxholes, they carved elaborate tunnel systems, reinforced bunkers, and interconnected cave networks that could withstand the heaviest artillery bombardment. Traditional tactics were failing. Artillery couldn't reach into the deepest caves. Air power couldn't see through the jungle canopy to identify camouflage positions. Infantry assaults became meat grinders, with American boys cut down by machine gun fire from positions they couldn't even see. The answer military leaders realized lay in a weapon that had been around since World War I, the flamethrower. Fire doesn't need to see its target. It finds every crevice, every hiding place, every last refuge where a determined enemy might make his stand. In 1941, engineers at the Army's Chemical Warfare Service began developing what would become the M1 flamethrower. On paper, it looked perfect. 2 gasoline tanks strapped to a soldier's back, a compressed nitrogen cylinder for pressure, and a handheld wand that could project burning liquid up to 20 yards. Simple, portable, and absolutely terrifying. The reality was far different. The M1 was a temperamental beast that seemed almost as dangerous to its operator as to the enemy. The ignition system had an unfortunate tendency to fail at the worst possible moments. Damp conditions, which described virtually every jungle battlefield in the Pacific, could render the weapon useless. Fuel leaks could turn the wielder into a human torch. Veterans tell stories that would be almost comical if they weren't so deadly. Flamethrower operators carrying cigarette lighters as backup ignition sources, fuel systems that would work perfectly during training, then fail completely when Japanese bullets started flying. Worst of all, the psychological burden of carrying a weapon that marked you as the enemy's primary target. The Japanese quickly learned to identify flamethrower operators and prioritize them above all other targets. A man carrying 60 pounds of gasoline and compressed gas, moving slowly through the jungle, made an irresistible target. The flame might reach 20 yards, but a Japanese sniper's bullet could reach much farther. Despite these flaws, the M1 showed glimpses of its devastating potential. Fire has a psychological impact that goes beyond its physical damage. It represents primal fear. Japanese soldiers who would fight to the death against rifle fire would sometimes abandon positions when faced with approaching flames. Sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the most unlikely places. In late summer 1943, on the training grounds of New Caledonia, an officer in the 754th Tank Battalion was watching flamethrower training exercises when inspiration struck. The exact identity remains lost to history. Some records suggest Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart. Others point to unnamed junior officers who saw the problem with fresh eyes. Whoever it was, they were watching American soldiers struggle with the portable M1 flamethrowers and asking themselves a simple question. What if we could give the flamethrower the protection it needed to do its job? The idea was almost absurdly simple. Take an M3A1 Stuart light tank, already proven in combat, and mount a flamethrower inside the turret, firing through the existing pistol ports. The tank would provide protection that flamethrower operators desperately needed, while the flamethrower would give the tank a weapon perfectly suited to bunker-busting warfare. Of course, simple ideas often prove anything but simple in execution. The Stuart's interior was cramped even for a standard two-man crew, and trying to fit a full-sized M1A1 flamethrower inside was like trying to stuff a telephone booth into a closet. But necessity is the mother of invention. Engineers began stripping down the M1A1 flamethrower, shortening barrels, reconfiguring fuel tanks, essentially rebuilding the weapon from the ground up. They mounted two 5-gallon gasoline canisters, one under the bow, gunner seat, another in place of ammunition storage, and jury-rigged the flame gun into the .30 caliber ball mount. The result looked like it had been assembled by a mad scientist, but it worked. By October 1943, the first modified tanks were in the hands of the 3rd Marine Tank Battalion, and a demonstration was hastily arranged near Noumea. The demonstration was a success, but time was running short. The Bougainville landings were scheduled for November 1st, and these flame tanks were expected to spearhead the assault on what intelligence described as the most heavily fortified Japanese positions yet encountered. When American forces landed on Bougainville on November 1st, 1943, they established a beachhead near Empress Augusta Bay, but the flame tanks weren't ready. Technical problems and the complexity of introducing a completely new weapon system meant the innovative flame tanks would have to wait. Meanwhile, the Japanese were constructing what would become known as the Hornet's Nest, a defensive complex that represented the evolution of Japanese defensive tactics. This wasn't just a collection of bunkers. The Hornet's Nest was an integrated defensive system stretching several hundred yards along the American perimeter, anchored by elements of the 2nd Battalion, 4th South Seas Garrison. The bunkers were constructed from reinforced logs and coral, designed to withstand direct artillery hits. They were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, meaning any American assault on one position would immediately come under fire from multiple others. Most cunningly, they were camouflaged so effectively that American aerial reconnaissance couldn't identify them, and connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to move unseen between positions. For 3 months, this defensive line held. American infantry assaults were bloodily repulsed. Artillery barrages barely scratched the reinforced positions below. Airstrikes proved equally ineffective. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had tried everything in their tactical playbook, and nothing worked. By January 1944, it was clear that conventional tactics weren't going to break the Hornet's Nest. It was time to try something unconventional. January 30th, 1944, dawned gray and humid on Bougainville, with oppressive heat that made steel burn to the touch. For the men of the 754th Tank Battalion, the weather was the least of their concerns. Today they would find out whether months of improvisation had created a war-winning weapon or an elaborate death trap. Major Reino Lehtinen had arrived with his forward detachment in 5 modified Stuart tanks that represented something entirely new in the American arsenal. These weren't just tanks that happened to carry flamethrowers. They were purpose-built weapons of psychological warfare. At 7:45 a.m., the preparatory bombardment began. Smoke mortars laid down a concealing screen, followed by 81mm mortars and artillery fire. By 8:30 a.m., Company C of the 132nd Infantry was advancing behind the tanks, with demolition teams ready to finish whatever the tanks started. The first disaster struck just after 9 a.m., and it was entirely self-inflicted. In the confusion of battle, friendly artillery fire struck one of the leading tanks. The Stuart erupted in flames, instantly killing Tank Commander Sergeant Minor J. Hall and severely wounding 2 other crewmen. Corporal Joe Simon managed to escape the inferno, but was immediately cut down by Japanese small arms fire as he tried to rescue his injured comrades. His sacrifice would later earn him a posthumous Silver Star, but at the moment it looked like the flame tank experiment was about to end in disaster. That's when Staff Sergeant Jesse Drowley proved that heroism comes in many forms. Breaking cover while Japanese bullets whined overhead, Drowley sprinted toward the burning tank. This wasn't calculated heroism. This was pure instinct, one soldier refusing to let his comrades die while he watched. Miraculously, he reached the wounded men and pulled them to safety. But Drowley's heroics were just beginning. As the remaining flame tanks pressed their attack, they encountered the fundamental problem that had plagued flamethrower operations: visibility. Inside the cramped confines of a Stuart tank, with vision blocks fogged by heat and humidity, tank crews often couldn't identify targets they needed to engage. One M3A1 had managed to spray liquid fuel through a Japanese bunker's openings, but the flamethrower failed to ignite. The operator, faced with a bunker full of unburned gasoline and a flamethrower that wouldn't light, made a decision that epitomized desperate Pacific War innovation. Opening his hatch while enemy bullets searched for him, he threw a thermite grenade onto the jet of fuel. The result was instantaneous and devastating. The fuel ignited in a bright, searing flash that filled the bunker with flames and eliminated the Japanese defenders in one terrible moment. At 10:30 a.m., the Japanese launched a counterattack with Molotov cocktails and concentrated mortar fire aimed specifically at the tanks. The attack claimed the lives of 2nd Lieutenant John White and Sergeant James Jarman, but it also revealed something important. The Japanese were as terrified of the flame tanks as American planners had hoped. It was during this counterattack that Jesse Drowley performed the action that would earn him the Medal of Honor. Spotting a hidden machine gun nest that was cutting down American troops, Drowley made another impossible sprint through enemy fire to the nearest flame tank. Climbing onto the deck while bullets sparked off the armor, he hammered on the turret with his rifle butt, desperately trying to communicate the machine gun nest's location. The tank crew unleashed their flames, but in the chaos and poor visibility, the fire fell short. That's when Drowley, already wounded by shrapnel and small arms fire, grabbed a submachine gun loaded with tracer rounds. Despite being shot in the chest and face, bleeding and half blind, Drowley used the glowing tracer rounds to paint the target for the tank crew. The bright lines of fire guided the flame tank's aim, and finally the enemy position was engulfed in flames. Drowley refused evacuation until he was certain the position was secure. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally presented him with the Medal of Honor, he was recognizing not just individual heroism, but the desperate courage that the Pacific War demanded from ordinary men. By early afternoon, the flame tanks had to withdraw to refuel and repressurize. Each burst of flame lasted barely 20 seconds, and supply lines were long and vulnerable. But the brief respite gave both sides a chance to assess what had happened. For the Americans, the results were both encouraging and sobering. The flame tanks had proven devastatingly effective against Japanese bunkers, but they had also proven vulnerable to enemy fire and mechanical failure. For the Japanese defenders, the morning had been a glimpse into a new kind of hell. Fire, unlike bullets or shell fragments, couldn't be stopped by armor or concrete. It found every crevice, every hiding place, every last refuge where a determined defender might make his stand. At 1:30 p.m., 5 M3A1 tanks returned to the front line, refueled and ready for the final assault. Working in coordination with infantry and demolition teams, they systematically reduced the Hornet's Nest bunker by bunker. By day's end, 28 Japanese bunkers had been destroyed. 14 were credited directly to the flamethrower tanks, with the remainder falling to portable flamethrowers, rifle fire, and demolitions. More importantly, the integrated defensive system that had held up American advances for 3 months had been shattered in a single day. The battle for the Hornet's Nest proved to be more than just a tactical victory. It was proof of concept that would reshape American armored doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. By mid-1944, purpose-built flamethrower tanks like the M4A3R3 Satan were entering combat just in time for the volcanic fortresses of Saipan and Guam. The lessons learned on Bougainville became doctrine. Tank infantry teams, with flamethrower tanks providing close support, became the standard method for reducing Japanese fortifications. The psychological impact proved almost as important as the physical destructive power. Japanese defenders who would fight to the death against conventional weapons would sometimes abandon positions when faced with approaching flames. But perhaps the most important legacy was what it revealed about American adaptability and innovation under pressure. Faced with an enemy that had turned defensive warfare into an art form, American forces had responded not just with superior firepower, but with creative thinking and battlefield improvisation. The flame tanks of Bougainville were born from the marriage of necessity and ingenuity, the recognition that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem lies not in doing the same thing better, but in doing something completely different. Yet for all the tactical innovation, it's important to remember that the battle was ultimately about human beings, young men facing death in a jungle hell thousands of miles from home. The casualty lists tell their own story. These weren't statistics, they were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They were the price paid for tactical innovation and strategic necessity. The flame tanks didn't just kill the Japanese defenders, they incinerated them, often in the very bunkers they had spent months constructing. It was a particularly horrible way to die, and even American veterans who witnessed the effects often spoke of them with a mixture of admiration for their effectiveness and revulsion at their brutality. The success at Bougainville accelerated development throughout the American military. By the time American forces assaulted Iwo Jima in February 1945, flamethrower tanks had evolved from battlefield improvisation to standard equipment. The M4A3R3 Satan tanks were a far cry from the jury-rigged Stuarts that had first proved the concept. These new tanks carried 290 gallons of napalm, a more effective flame fuel that burned hotter and stuck to surfaces better than gasoline. They could project flames up to 150 yards, nearly 8 times the range of the original M1 portable flamethrowers. Most importantly, they were reliable. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended World War II before the full potential of American flamethrower tanks could be realized. Instead, the flame tanks that had been born from desperation in the jungles of Bougainville found themselves obsolete almost overnight. Yet the legacy extended far beyond their immediate military impact. They represented something quintessentially American: the ability to look at an impossible problem and find an unconventional solution. Faced with Japanese defensive positions that seemed impregnable, American forces hadn't simply accepted the necessity of bloody frontal assaults. Instead, they had innovated, improvised, and ultimately created a weapon that turned the enemy's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. Today, the flame tanks of World War II are largely forgotten, overshadowed by more famous weapons. Most Americans, if they think of flamethrowers at all, picture the portable weapons carried by individual soldiers, not the massive tank-mounted systems that proved so decisive in the Pacific. The Hornet's nest on Bougainville was broken not by superior numbers or overwhelming firepower, but by American ingenuity and the courage of ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things. The devil's breath that emerged from those modified Stuart tanks on January 30th, 1944, was more than just a new weapon. It was proof that American innovation, courage, and determination could overcome any obstacle, no matter how formidable it might seem. In the steaming jungles of the Pacific, where young men fought and died for islands most Americans couldn't find on a map, the flame tanks wrote their own chapter in the story of American victory. It's a chapter that deserves to be remembered, not just for its tactical innovations or strategic implications, but for what it reveals about the character of the men who fought the Pacific War. They were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things, and their legacy burns as bright today as the flames that broke the Hornet's nest more than 80 years ago. That's another untold story from World War II, brought to you by World War IIpedia. If you enjoyed learning about these forgotten heroes and their innovative weapons, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got dozens more incredible stories waiting to be discovered.